Good day. Over the course of my programme yesterday, I discussed various claims that were circulating in the Western media, based, by the way, on certain comments made by Ukraine's Deputy Defence Minister, Hanna Maliar, and which had been reproduced by the British news agency Reuters, which claimed that Ukraine had finally fully captured the village of Rabotino in the Zaporozhzhie region, this village north of the great Russian fortified lines, which Ukraine has been struggling to capture ever since it launched its offensive on the 4th of June. And the media in the West, at least in Britain, reported on Hanna Maliar's claim and on this dispatch from Reuters. And I think it's fair to say that in Britain, at least, it was taken as axiomatic that the information provided by Hanna Maliar was correct. I noticed over the course of yesterday that the American media was a lot more careful. An article reporting Hanna Maliar's claims or comments in the New York Times was carefully entitled "Ukraine claims to have captured Rabotino." So, whereas the British media was talking about Ukraine confirming that it had captured Rabotino, and other articles in the Financial Times and the Daily Telegraph and the BBC all took it as axiomatic that Rabotino had been captured by Ukraine. As I said, the New York Times was careful to say in the title that this is a claim made by Ukraine and not an actual fact. And I noticed also that the Washington Post was giving very little weight, very little coverage to the story. Anyway, I also pointed out yesterday in my program that there were the Russian reports from the area of Rabotino appeared to be contradicting the Ukrainian claims. They were saying that the Ukrainian claims were wrong, that the fight for Rabotino was still ongoing, that the Russians still held the southern part of the village, that the central area was a contested zone. They did concede that a big Ukrainian attack had taken place, but they effectively denied that Rabotino had in fact been captured. Well, over the course of the day and over the course of the night, and indeed early this morning, there's been a steady trickle of reports from this area, and they do appear to suggest that in fact it is the Russian reports that are correct, that the Russians do still hold part of Rabotino, and that the fight for the village is not yet over. Now, I say that, of course, let me reiterate again, I'm not there. I'm not in direct contact with anybody who is there. I'm getting this information from sources, from channels which claim to be in touch with reliable sources, but channels, Russian channels, pro-Russian channels that are providing this information tend, in my experience, to be reliable ones. And as of this morning, they are still claiming that the fight for Rabotino is underway. Now, there's even been a video which purports to show some Russian soldiers physically present in Rabotino and fighting the Ukrainians there. Though, as I've said many times, I'm not a good person to assess videos of this kind, and I'm not going to draw any conclusions from it. Anyway, in summary, my own belief, my personal view, is that the Russian reports are correct. I'm more sure of this, significantly more sure of this, than I was yesterday. And it seems to me that not for the first time, Hanna Maliar has reported something that she would like to have happened, not something which has as of yet actually happened. And when she claimed that Rabotino was under Ukrainian control, she was straightforwardly wrong. Just to repeat one more time, I don't necessarily think that Hanna Maliar is setting out to deceive people. I have been tracking a lot of what she's been saying over the course of the war. I get the sense that she's not much of an important decision maker in the military side of things in Ukraine. I think she reports what she is told, but I am of the view that a lot of what she is told quite often simply isn't true, and that is the case with the fighting in Rabotino. Now, today there has been a very interesting little piece in the Daily Telegraph from somebody called Joe Barnes, who I presume is a reporter in the area. And this is what this article says. It says that Ukrainian armed forces have reportedly gained a foothold less than 3 miles from Russia's defense lines in the southern Zaporozhzhie region. The Russian defense lines that are referenced here are clearly the great fortified lines, the Surovikin line, as it has come increasingly to be called. And then it goes on to say, this is the article in the Daily Telegraph, Kiev's general staff said on Tuesday its forces had achieved success within the recaptured frontiers and were attacking detected enemy targets with artillery as well as carrying out counter-battery measures. The news came after Ukrainian officials claimed the nearby village of Rabotino had been liberated after weeks of fighting over the settlement. Notice that now it is claimed, it is no longer confirmed, and then the article goes on to say something that is absolutely true. In recent weeks, Ukrainian forces split to launch another attack in between the villages of Novodanilovka and Verbove. Verbove is more a small town, as I understand it, than just a village. But anyway, that's all I would say. And then the Daily Telegraph, as it likes to do, references Russian sources, including a blogger called Romanov, whom I have no knowledge of. He's somebody that I've never come across before, but no doubt he is an actual blogger who describes the situation as very dangerous and have discussed the potential vulnerabilities of their forces in the area over the past week. The British media, and by the way, the British Ministry of Defence, has a habit of doing this. When they want to report Ukrainian successes, they tend to obtain corroboration from Russian sources, or like to seek corroboration from what they say are Russian sources. When things are not going well, or when the Russian sources tend to contradict the claims from Ukraine's success, they tend to ignore them. And this is what we've seen with the fighting in Rabotino. They've not mentioned the fact that all the authoritative Russian sources are denying that Rabotino has been fully captured by Ukraine. And as I said, for the record, the comments made by the bloggers or the Russian sources that are referenced in the Daily Telegraph actually, to my mind, add nothing. But let's pass this article in the Daily Telegraph carefully, because firstly we read that Ukrainian forces have reportedly gained a foothold less than 3 miles from Russia's defensive lines in the southern Zaporozhzhie region. Now on Friday, Mark Milley was claiming that the Ukrainians had pierced the Russian defensive lines. And yesterday, after Rabotino was allegedly captured by Ukraine, the British media was saying the same thing. Today, we read in the Telegraph that actually they're still 3 miles away from reaching these Russian defensive lines. And as I said already, we're now told that Ukrainian officials are claiming that they have captured Rabotino. It's no longer said that they have actually done so. And we also read about how the Ukrainian forces have split to launch another attack in between the villages of Novodanilovka and Verbovye. This is the area to the east of Rabotino, where the Ukrainians have been trying to push forward across the empty fields and forest plantations. And it is indeed the case that they have come very close to the Russian fortified lines in this area, probably within 3 miles of them. If you look at Russian-produced maps, you can see this. But, of course, what has happened is that Ukrainian forces, which have moved into these open fields, are now very exposed to Russian artillery. In fact, they can be shelled, in effect, from 3 sides. And there are lots of Russian reports that Ukrainian losses in this area have been extremely high. So, this is an interesting little piece in the Daily Telegraph. If you read it carefully, you see how it actually backtracks on a lot of the claims that were made yesterday. Rabotino, from having fallen or been captured by Ukraine, it's now said that the Ukrainians are claiming to have captured it. From the earlier claims made on Friday by Mark Milley, repeated yesterday in the Daily Telegraph and in other parts of the British media, that the Russian fortified lines had been pierced, that the Ukrainians had broken through. We now learn that they haven't even reached them. They're still 3 miles from reaching them. And we also learn about this other Ukrainian attempt to try to advance between the villages of Novodanilovka and Verbovye, much discussed by Russian commentators and bloggers and reporters and all of these people. The Daily Telegraph finally is acknowledging that this is indeed what has happened, and as I said, it's not giving us a complete picture. It's not telling us about the losses that Ukraine has experienced, apparently, in advancing in this particular area, nor is it mentioning that Russian commentators, those same Russian commentators, bloggers, reporters, all of those people, are saying that the Ukrainian advance or attempted advance in this area has come to a stop. I don't want to make any more of this. It's just a further object lesson in 2 things. Firstly, be very careful about necessarily accepting reports you get from the front lines, from the battlefronts. Both sides will always give an over-optimistic interpretation of events. When I say both sides, I mean by that the defense ministries of both sides. But for the record, the most reliable reports of the fighting consistently come from the kind of sources, places like Slavyangrad, those sort of sources, which tend to be aligned with the Russian side, and in an odd sort of way, this article in the Daily Telegraph confirms as much. Not only have they pulled back from some of the euphoric claims they were making yesterday, but they are in effect confirming the accuracy of what places like Slavyangrad and others have actually been saying all along. Just saying, just a way of getting a better sense of what is actually going on and where one should go to for the accurate information about what is actually going on the battlefronts, which is not always easy to do because there is so much uncertainty and obscurity about what is happening on the battlefronts. Anyway, to repeat, it seems to me that we can now say with a fair degree of certainty that the fighting in Rabotino is still ongoing and that the Ukrainians have not broken through any of the big Russian fortified lines. They're certainly not marching on to Berdyansk, as some people have claimed. In fact, for the record, I get the sense that in this area, despite strenuous efforts, once again, Ukrainian attempts to break through the great Russian fortifications to the south and to capture Rabotino itself and even to penetrate through the minefields, that all of these Ukrainian attempts have fallen short. By the way, I was reading reports, these again are from Russian sources, over the course of yesterday, talking about large numbers of Ukrainian vehicles, armoured vehicles having been committed to these particular attacks in the Rabotino area. There was one report I noticed which spoke about Strikers and Marders and Leopard 2s and Bradleys operating in this area of the battlefront, all of which is true. But it also mentioned Challenger 2s, that the Challenger 2s had finally been committed to the fight. There have been some videos which have started to appear and photographs which have started to appear, which show the wreckages of what are supposed to be Ukrainian armoured vehicles littering the landscape, supposedly following these attacks. But I have noticed an interesting thing, which is that the Russian Defense Ministry, even as it continues to report that Ukrainian attacks near Rabotino have been repelled, has not been providing a great deal of information about the total numbers of Ukrainian armoured vehicles that have been destroyed in this part of the front lines. There is starting to be a divergence between the information one is getting from Russian sources close to the fighting and what the Russian Defense Ministry is reporting. Now, I take that to mean that the fighting is indeed still ongoing, that the Russians are waiting for the fighting to subside before adding up all the numbers of tanks, armoured vehicles and such things as have been lost over the course of the fighting over the last week or so, and then at some point, presumably within the next few days, the Russian Defense Ministry, as it likes to do, will give us an overall total. So, anyway, that's what is going on the situation in and around Rabotino and the front lines in the south, despite claims yesterday, despite claims made by Mark Milley on Friday, despite other claims made over the course of the weekend. Ukraine's attacks in this area have fallen short, and the Russian defences are holding, and of course the major fortified lines, the Surovikin line, as the Daily Telegraph has now acknowledged, that has not yet even been reached. So that's all I'm going to say now about this part of the fighting. There's been another rather interesting piece of information about the war, which again confirms that Ukrainian reports are not always to be relied upon. Now, a couple of days ago, on the 27th of August, Ukraine launched a major drone strike, or said it had, upon an airfield in the Kursk region. And there were all kinds of claims. I remember reading them in all kinds of places, especially in the British media. From recollection, I think the Daily Telegraph was carrying a lot of these claims. Anyway, there were reports that the Ukrainian drones had penetrated, that they'd reached this airbase, that large numbers of Russian aircraft, I believe 5 Sukhoi 30 fighter bombers, 1 MiG-29 of the Russian Air Force had been destroyed, and that there'd been extensive damage to the airfields and to the air defences of this particular airfield. And there was no confirmation of any of this from any Russian source. Last night, we got satellite photos, and I should stress these are American satellite photos, commercial satellite photos of this particular airfield. Two things immediately stood out for me. Firstly, this is a huge airbase. It's a massive, sprawling airbase with a large, very big runway, lots of subsidiary places where aircraft are stored. This is a very big airbase indeed. But the key point is there was no evidence of any damage on this airbase at all. Nothing. No sign of wreckage. I don't think it would have been possible in the few days since this reported attack to clear this airbase entirely of the wreckage of burnt-out aircraft or that kind of thing, if the attack on the airbase had been anywhere near as successful as Ukraine claims. In fact, the photos suggest that if there was an attack on the airbase, which I presume there was, then it was completely unsuccessful, and that the airbase's defences worked effectively, and that none of the drones got through, and that all the Ukrainian claims about damage to the airbase and to aircraft upon it were simply wrong. And I think this is conclusive, and again, it is a further example of Ukraine not always reporting things which have actually happened. Now, sometimes Ukraine is more accurate in its reports. It does seem, for example, as if a Ukrainian drone attack on a Russian air defense missile installation in Crimea did hit the target there. Ukraine claimed that it was an S-400. Russian sources say it was an S-300, a less sophisticated and modern system. But nonetheless, an air defense installation was indeed at least damaged and perhaps even destroyed over the course of this air attack. So not everything that Ukraine says is wrong, but very often, I'm afraid, it is. I still remain doubtful, for example, about that photograph of the Tupolev 22M3 bomber, which was supposed to have been destroyed by the drone attack on the airbase in northern Russia. When I first saw that photograph, I thought it was probably a true picture of an actually destroyed bomber. I've now had real reason to doubt that. Again, I'm not the best person to assess these photographs. But anyway, the point is, one always needs to be skeptical about reports from either side of the battlefronts. Now, that brings me to what is going on in the other area where there's been a great deal of fighting, and this is, of course, Kupiansk. And here it should be stressed that it is the Russians who are very much on the initiative here. And by the way, today there has been an article published in The Guardian about the situation in Kupiansk. It's talking about Ukrainian steps to evacuate civilians from Kupiansk It doesn't give a detailed overview of the state of the fighting near Kupiansk, but it does report Ukrainian dismay at the fact that Kupiansk is under threat, that the Russians do appear to be pushing towards this particular town. It admits that the Ukrainians have been taken by surprise by this Russian advance. It also admits that Ukraine, after it recaptured Kupiansk last autumn, never considered the possibility that the Russians might return. And it's an interesting article, as I said, it doesn't provide us with a great deal of information. But, as I said, these revelations of dismay and surprise on the part of Ukraine are there. But, again, we've had more information, not from Ukrainian sources this time, but again from Russian sources. And they do provide us with an update of what is actually happening around Kupiansk, lifting the fog of war a little. Now, I mentioned some videos ago that there were claims that Sinkovka, this village, on the Sinkovka ledge, on the high ground, close to Kupiansk, very close to Kupiansk, had been captured by the Russians. I said I wasn't sure that this was indeed the case. There were other reports that Sinkovka had been encircled by the Russians, and that did seem to be true. Well, the latest reports, which by the way again have read on Slavyangrad, though apparently they originate from other sources. Anyway, they provided clarification about this. It seems that the Russians have indeed largely, but not entirely, encircled Sinkovka. It seems that the Russians have not actually entered Sinkovka, which corresponds with my own feeling about what had happened there. It does seem as if the Ukrainians have abandoned most of Sinkovka, which is now in the grey zone. In other words, it's contested. But it does also seem that the Ukrainians continue to hold out in a part of Sinkovka on its western outskirts. And it seems that despite the fact that the Russians have largely encircled this village, and there have been maps which show Russian positions around this village, and it does seem to be almost encircled. It does seem that the Ukrainians have some capacity to move in and out of this village to try to maintain some kind of a presence there, though doing so would expose them both to Russian mortar and small arms fire, let alone, of course, heavier artillery, though I doubt that heavy artillery is indeed being used in this particular area. And the information does appear to confirm steady Russian progress around Kupiansk. There's not so far been any attempt to strike at Kupiansk itself, the metropolitan area, but it does seem as if the Russians are closing in on the village of Petropavlovka, a bigger place, by the way, than Sinkovka, and they do seem to be steadily gaining control of more and more of the fortified posts that the Ukrainians have tried to create around Kupiansk on its outskirts. Ukraine has been launching counterattacks, trying to slow down the Russians, but the Russians are gradually, methodically closing in. Now, I have to say, there are claims from Ukraine that there are 110,000 Russian troops in this area. That claim was repeated, by the way, in that article in the Guardian that I alluded to. That may very well be true. But my overall sense is that the numbers of troops that are fighting in and around Kupiansk on both sides is significantly less than that, and that the Russian forces near Kupiansk are probably only a fraction of that number, and that the Ukrainian forces are probably fewer than that, but we're talking about tens of thousands of troops rather than hundreds of thousands of troops on either side. And the article in The Guardian alluded to what apparently the Ukrainians most fear might happen in Kupiansk. Interestingly, this is not that the Russians will try to storm the town, but rather that the Russians will do to Ukraine in Kupiansk what they previously did in Bakhmut. This is to say, turning it into another killing zone, a place where the Russians will relentlessly press on the Ukrainians, knowing that Kupiansk, because of its symbolic importance, because of its position on the Oskol River, because of its position as a transportation hub, very much like Bakhmut, is a place which Ukraine would find difficult to give up, so that the Ukrainians are forced to defend it, exposing them to relentless Russian artillery fire, causing Ukraine to suffer massive further losses. In other words, that the Russians will apply the same kind of meat grinder tactics to the Ukrainians in Kupiansk that they previously used in Bakhmut. And with the Ukrainian army having suffered, well, I'm going to say catastrophic losses, first in Bakhmut and then in Zaporozhzhie region on the front lines over the course of this offensive. Well, Ukraine obviously cannot afford another Bakhmut in Kupiansk. Now, is that what the Russians are actually planning to do? Again, I want to stress, I don't know. The Russian General Staff, as I've pointed out on many occasions, does not share its plans with me. But that is what the Ukrainian officials on the ground were telling The Guardian that they most fear. They can't just abandon Kupiansk. They have to send forces to reinforce in Kupiansk. Kupiansk is too symbolically important as the most important town that Ukraine has captured in the northern, on the eastern front since the start of the war. Of course, Kherson Kherson city is, of course, an even bigger and more important place, but on the eastern frontiers, on the eastern front lines, Kupiansk is perhaps the most symbolically charged and important place that the Ukrainians recaptured from the Russians. It's an important transportation and logistical hub. Ukraine can't just abandon it. It will have to defend it. Defending Kupiansk, however, would lead or risks the same catastrophic losses that Ukraine suffered in Bakhmut. Again, to no ultimate avail, Bakhmut fell, and all attempts by Ukraine to recapture it, which have been ongoing since May, have come to naught. The same could happen in Kupiansk. And of course, Ukraine can't continue to accept bloodletting on this kind of scale. It cannot afford another repeat of the Russian meat grinder tactics, which have proved so ruthlessly effective in other places where the Russians have applied them. As I said previously, we will see what the Russian plans are. I got the impression over the course of the Bakhmut fighting that Had the Russian army really been intent on capturing Bakhmut quickly over the course of the winter, it could have done so. And maybe it is taking the same approach in Kupiansk. Rather than carry out an immediate assault to capture Kupiansk, maybe it is creating the scene there, setting the scene there for a repeat of the meat grinder tactics that proved so deadly for the Ukrainians in Bakhmut. According to The Guardian, that is what the Ukrainians fear. Well, that is the situation on the front lines today. Rabotino, not so far captured by Ukraine. Ukraine still sending men and machines trying to capture Rabotino, trying to break through, not the Russian defense lines in the south, but just to reach the Russian defense lines in the south. Suffering very heavy losses in the process. Ukrainian attacks in the Bakhmut area, all unsuccessful. There's been more comments about this from Ramzan Kadyrov, whose Chechen forces are now playing a leading role in the fighting in and around Bakhmut. But in every respect, Ukrainian attacks in the Bakhmut area are failing. More Russian advances towards Kupiansk, and Ukrainian fears that they're going to face another meat grinder in Kupiansk. Horrible expression though that is, something similar to what happened to them in Bakhmut, and something, by the way, that they have inflicted upon themselves in the Zaporozhzhie area, in these attacks from Orechov towards Rabotino and beyond, and of course also in the Vremivka salient area, where the Russians are reporting that there's been a downtick in the fighting. They're saying that Ukraine is redeploying troops to the Vremivka salient area, but there doesn't seem to be much in the way of Ukrainian attacks going on. So, overall, that is the state of the war. Ukraine continues to try to press forward with its offensive. It continues to lose men and machines. The original offensive, the original attempt at a breakthrough, was to be carried out by the so-called 9th Corps, of which the main breakthrough unit was the 47th Mechanized Brigade, equipped with Leopard 2s and Bradleys. There's a report that I've seen which says that the original plan was that Ukraine would break through the main defense lines, the Surovikin line, within 3 days, and that it would only need 8,000 men to do it. This is men drawn from the 9th Corps, the 47th Mechanized Brigade, and other supporting units. That attack catastrophically miscarried. In the last week of July, more troops, this time called in from the reserve force, the 10th Corps, were committed to try to achieve a further breakthrough in the Rabotino, Zaporozhzhie area, to break through the defense lines, to push on towards Tokmak. That failed, and then over the last week or so, Ukraine has committed its last reserve force, the 82nd Airborne Brigade, the one with the Strikers and the Marders and the Challenger 2s. Its primary focus has been less, from what I can see, on Rabotino itself. There's been this change of tactics, this attempt to advance across the open fields towards the Surovikin line, to break through between the villages of Novodanilovka and Verbove, and again, heavy losses, very heavy losses apparently, in men and machines. So far, no breakthrough, and this cack-handed admission today in the Daily Telegraph that the Surovikin line still has not been reached. So, overall, a grim outlook for Ukraine. I get the sense that people in the United States increasingly understand this, but there continues to be a huge reluctance in the United States to rethink strategy. And David Ignatius, who is, to put it mildly, a journalist in the United States who is very, very close to the thinking of the US government, the current administration. He was a major supporter, media supporter, or so it seems to me, of the Democratic Party. Certainly he was a harsh critic of Donald Trump, and as I well remember, he played a not insubstantial role at the start of the Russiagate affair, being the journalist, for example, who reported stories about Donald Trump's first national security advisor, Michael Flynn, which ultimately resulted in Michael Flynn's prosecution. A sordid episode which I've discussed many times in other places. Anyway, David Ignatius has now said that despite the fact that things are not going well on the battlefronts, well, you have to read through what he's saying. He talks about incremental Ukrainian advances and all those sort of things. But despite the things going far more slowly than expected, he said that there continues to be, right across the US government, a united belief that the current strategy of as long as it takes is the right one. This is not the right moment to enter into negotiations. We must carry on giving Ukraine all the support that we can and hope, keep our fingers crossed, that sooner or later it all comes right and that some great breakthrough or victory will take place. This despite the fact that there have been all those admissions from other sources in the United States that the US's ability to keep Ukraine supplied with machines and equipment, with more tanks, more infantry fighting vehicles, to provide further training, to do all of these sorts of things, that's now starting to run down. But if you believe Ignatius, doubts about what to do don't really exist. Everybody continues to be united in willing continued support for Ukraine. Now, I have to say, when I read things like that, when I'm told that right across the US government there is this consensus, I take the opposite view. I think that when we're told that everybody is united in agreement, that a consensus like that exists, it's a sign that somebody in the United States government is becoming concerned that the consensus is cracking, and they've gone to a friendly journalist, one with a high profile, in this case David Ignatius, and they're telling him, disregard all of these rumours about divisions and recriminations and all of these things. We are all still united in support of the current policy. There is no prospect of the policy changing. We will continue to provide Ukraine with all the support that it needs and which we can, and that despite all suggestions of negotiations, that's not on our agenda. There is no plan B. We are sticking with plan A. And as I said, when I read things like that, I'm afraid, perhaps because I have a skeptical point of view, I assume that the truth is actually the opposite, that there is now fierce discussions going on, perhaps not at the level of the White House itself, or the National Security Council, or the State Department. Maybe there, people are still trying to hold the line, to stick with the existing policy, in which the United States is now so heavily invested. But further down, within the bureaucracy, within the national security state, within the foreign policy establishment, within the Council for Foreign Relations, more concerns are growing, and more arguments are growing that the recriminations are indeed taking place, and that there are indeed arguments about what to do. And we're also getting increasing signs of worry and nervousness in Europe. We've now had a very interesting article in Bild Zeitung about discussions that Olaf Scholz of Germany and Emmanuel Macron are having with each other. And it turns out that they've been comparing notes about their discussions with Putin, which, by the way, have come to a complete stop. It seems that both men have been trying to reach out to Putin, to establish contacts with him, to speak to him, and that he's simply refusing their calls. By the way, that Moscow Times article, which discussed the outreach by ex-US diplomats and the Council for Foreign Relations, people from the Council for Foreign Relations, their attempts to get Tier 1.5 talks underway in Moscow, which have going nowhere and have hit an impasse. Anyway, the ex-diplomat who briefed Moscow Times says that the White House has also tried to speak to Putin, and that Putin has again refused calls. It is refusing calls now from the White House as well. So anyway, coming back to Macron and Scholz, apparently they're talking to each other about the situation, and that's an interesting fact in itself. They're probably talking about the fact that they can't get through to Putin. They're probably frustrated about their inability to get through to Putin. And the testament to their frustration is that they have apparently confirmed to each other that when each of them has spoken to Putin, which has not been the case now for many months, to their astonishment, Putin has never brought up the topic of the sanctions. He's never discussed them. He's never mentioned the sanctions at all. These were the sanctions which were supposed to crush the Russian economy, to undermine Putin's position, to rock the establishment in Moscow, to create a massive economic crisis in Russia, that were supposed to turn the oligarchs against Putin, that were supposed to undermine Putin. Well, Putin just doesn't bring them up. Russian economy apparently continues on solid growth. The Russian finance minister, Anton Siluanov, has now said that he apparently expects growth this year to be 2.5% GDP growth. Industrial manufacturing growth apparently is much higher. The recent increase in interest rates doesn't so far seem to be impacting on the surge in industrial and manufacturing growth. Every day I'm reading accounts of new factories being opened in Russia and new production lines being established to accelerate production of various types of industrial goods, heavy industrial goods, to replace sanctions. There's a major program to press on with building of Tupolev 214 civil airliners to replace Western aircraft. The Irkut company which produces the MS-21, has now taken back the name Yakovlev from the Yakovlev Design Bureau. And apparently the MS-21, the plan again is to rename it eventually the Yak 242. That was to be its original title. Anyway, apparently work is now accelerating on developing that. Today is news that another Russian civil aircraft, the Sukhoi Superjet, has now flown for the first time with its Russian avionics suite. There's a major investment program in relaunching on a large scale Russian civil aircraft production. There's talk about launching production of the Baikal small turboprop aircraft, passenger aircraft in Belarus. All of that's going on. Inflation, it does look, will be higher than it had seemed that it might be earlier this year. Siluanov said that it might reach by the end of the year 6%. Well, we'll see. But 6% is hardly a disaster for the Russians. The expectation is that inflation will fall again. And yes, there's been another slight softening of the ruble against the dollar. As I said, a topic that always comes up whenever one discusses the state of the ruble, the situation of the ruble. The ruble seems to be continuing, however, to strengthen against the euro. I suspect that what looks like a slight softening of the ruble against the dollar is more a case of the dollar strengthening against all currencies, as it appears to be doing at the moment, than anything more than that. So anyway, Scholz and Macron are confronted with the fact that all that effort, all that energy to impose sanctions on the Russians, it's not affected Putin at all. He shows no willingness to talk about this topic with the Europeans at all. And now he's gone even further, and he's not even taking their calls. One person that Putin does seem intending to meet is Erdogan. Erdogan is apparently flying to Moscow early in September. He's talking about relaunching the grain deal, but it's clear that what is actually being discussed is not relaunching the grain deal as such. There's not going to be any change of Russian position on exports of Ukrainian grain from the Black Sea ports. It's rather the case that the Russians are going to supply more grain to Turkey, both for re-export and also for Turkey's own domestic use. And I read a very interesting piece about this, which explains some of Erdogan's anxieties. It seems that though Turkey has increasingly been buying grain, mainly used for animal feed, by the way, from Russia, it has until recently still bought large quantities of grain from Ukraine. And Erdogan is concerned about any stoppage of the export of Ukrainian feed to Turkey, because Erdogan is particularly concerned in the elections, local elections next year, to regain control of the local government in Istanbul, Turkey's largest city, which has gone over to the opposition. Erdogan wants to regain control of Istanbul, and he needs to keep food inflation in Istanbul low in order to have a hope of doing that. And that's basically one of the reasons he wants to sort out these problems with grain and food. But with another bumper harvest, the Russians are in a position to help, And I suspect that in what I suspect will be a very complex and intricate negotiation between Erdogan and Putin in Moscow, the Russians will indeed agree to cut the Turks into some of the Russian grain trade, even as the Russians make moves to do the same with Turkey's perennial rival, Egypt, with which the Russians also have very good terms, and whose membership of the BRICS the Russians, of course, strongly supported. So, one other person has been talking to President Putin, and this is Prime Minister Modi of India. And I suspect that the reasons for this, well, in fact, it's not difficult to guess why this discussion has taken place, which is, of course, that Putin has given some indications that he is not intending to attend the G20 meeting in Delhi in September. And the reason for that is not because Putin has any concerns that he might be arrested, either in Delhi or on his way there. To be very clear, India is not part of the Rome Statute. It would not execute an ICC warrant. And in the case of a travel to India, journey to India, Putin can reach India traveling across safe territory. He would not have to worry about his plane being intercepted or anything of that nature. So I think the reason why Putin is hinting that he might not come to India for the G20 summit is twofold. Firstly, I think he does not want to be put in a position where the Western leaders cold shoulder him and perhaps wreck the summit, causing embarrassment to his Indian hosts, to the Indian hosts. The second is that I think that for Putin now, and indeed for China and South Africa and other ones of these countries, the priority is no longer the G20, which is probably now coming to the end of its life. Most probably it is the BRICS. The focus now will be increasingly on building up the BRICS, which are expanding and setting up their own financial system. The G20 has had its day, and its importance is going to slowly fade. Anyway, I'm going to read out the Russian readout of the telephone call between Putin and Modi. And it reads as follows. Vladimir Putin once again warmly congratulated Narendra Modi on the successful touchdown of the Indian lunar lander Chandrayaan-3 on the lunar South Pole region. The sides confirmed their readiness to further bilateral space cooperation. The results of the 15th BRICS summit in Johannesburg were discussed with a focus on the importance of the agreements reached, primarily on BRICS expansion, which undoubtedly would promote the growth of its influence in international affairs. It was agreed to closely collaborate in the context of Russia's BRICS chairmanship, which starts on January 1st, 2024. The parties also exchanged views on the upcoming G20 summit in New Delhi. The discussion also touched on current issues of Russian-Indian relations, which are developing progressively in the spirit of a specially privileged strategic partnership. Vladimir Putin and Narendra Modi stated that the two countries' trade and economic cooperation showed positive dynamics and expressed their shared intention to consistently implement large-scale energy projects and work together to expand the international transport and logistics infrastructure. So, emphasis on economic cooperation, even a brief allusion to possible space cooperation. Well, we'll see about that. But the major stress is on the BRICS. Yes, there'll be this G20 summit in India. They have to get through that. But the focus for the Russians now is the BRICS, and it doesn't seem, from this readout, as if the Indians fundamentally disagree. On the subject of large-scale energy projects and working together, I also saw, by the way, a brief report about Russian shipments of energy and materials and freight cargo now heading towards Saudi Arabia across Iran. So potentially those transportation links from Russia across Central Asia, from Central Asia to Iran to the Persian Gulf and to Saudi Arabia, also being set up too. Well, I should say that is probably still a work in progress. It may come as a surprise, but until fairly recently, there weren't actually transportation linkages between Russia and Iran to any great extent. During the Cold War, the two sides had been on opposite sides in the Cold War. After the Iranian Revolution of 1979, relations between the Soviet Union and Iran grew warmer, but were never completely without a certain degree of suspicion. Now, with Iran being in the BRICS, it's likely that that will end. Iran, of course, is not just in the BRICS, it's also the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The Russians and the Iranians will be building up their transportation links. The Chinese, of course, will be doing the same. So will the Indians. Iran quite likely becoming an important hub as well. And we see that Saudi Arabia also is starting to be integrated into this system. Continue to be lots of articles in the Western media denying the reality of the development of the BRICS. I read one which spoke about the BRICS becoming a rag bag of different countries, all different and incompatible with each other. I think this is to completely misunderstand what is going on. I've discussed it at length in previous programs. I think that, as I said, an alternative trade system to the Western one is now in the process of being created. It'll probably take some years before it fully matures, but we can see that the work to do it is now well underway. Well, that's my program for today. Let me reiterate again, at the moment we are in a state of unstable equilibrium on the battlefronts. There are more and more Russian reports and indeed demands within Russia for some big offensive to take place over the course of the autumn period. There's been more and more claims that Russia can't just win the war by remaining on the defensive indefinitely, however effective and successful the defensive is, and however effective it is wearing the Ukrainian forces down. We will see what the Russians are planning in the Kupiansk area, whether they really do intend a frontal advance there, or whether, as the Ukrainians apparently fear, they're planning to create another Meatgrinder type situation for Ukraine there, which would be devastating for Ukraine. But the overall story remains the same as it has done throughout the summer. Ukraine continuing to launch this offensive, continue to batter away, bang its head against these Russian lines, failing to make any significant progress suffering horrendous losses as it tries to do so, with the Russians getting stronger every day and with the balance incrementally, steadily, day by day, shifting further and further in their favour. So that's my programme today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programmes on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop. Find all the great things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, just to say again, if you like this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon, and have a very good day.